Welcome back once again. We commence now the final panel discussion of today's conference with the title, The Final Frontier, Back to Space or Not. I would like to reiterate the appreciation of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for the partnership in putting together today's conference with Drexel University and the Franklin Institute. Both of these institutions are leaders not only in our region but globally in both the advancement of science and technology and in science and technology education. I also want to reiterate the Council's thanks to Thomas Jefferson University and Hospital for its sponsorship of the panel that we heard earlier today on the future of medical science. So I started off this morning, I guess I've said it a couple times now, by saying that as a child of the 1960s, there once was a time for me when, and indeed for our nation and the world, when the future of technology and the promise of the future of humanity seemed clear and bright, perhaps nearly inevitable. Those kinds of feelings were never more so than on the night of July 20th, 1969, when Apollo 11 landed on the moon. That night was as hot as any July evening in Philadelphia since William Penn arrived in this place. And in my home as an 8-year-old, only my older sister's room had air conditioning, and it had a wonderful 13-inch color television. My big brother had just returned from Vietnam, but was still serving in the Army and was still away from the family on that night. And my parents, as I recall it at this distance, had a kind of a generational allergy to air conditioning, which they didn't overcome for a couple of years thereafter. I think that they thought that this high technology had gone too far. But in any case, they were watching on a different TV in a different room. So my big sister, Susan, who's here today, and I watched the flickering images as Buzz Aldrin and his partner Neil Armstrong made history on a scale almost too monumental to grasp then or nearly 50 years since. It is obviously, therefore, an enormous privilege and honor for me today and for the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia to welcome here the living legend, Colonel Buzz Aldrin. Please.
Is that a key for me to get up and do something?
I think he's going to keep going. We are most delighted as well to have Colonel Aldrin joined by another leading figure in space studies, Derrick, the chief astronomer for our partner institution, the Franklin Institute. I turn to each of our guests, Colonel Aldrin going first, for their opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Craig. I've got someone joining me in the front row here, and if he'll stand up and let everybody look at his T-shirt.
Yes.
I've had an office in Los Angeles, and several years back, I thought I was doing some pretty big things regarding the space program. At least I thought so. But I found that our main business was selling T-shirts. And I thought, now, come on. Here, I'm trying to do something for the leadership of the nation and the world and advance the world to outward in the solar system. And we're selling T-shirts. Well, we're selling T-shirts again, but it sort of caught fire. And if anybody you know likes to compose songs, I'm looking for a song that goes along with that. I keep saying this, but I haven't had too many offers. But you see, I'm getting tired of this fly me to the moon business. I thought that was pretty good for a while when it first came out, and never did I think that I'd be doing something like that. In looking over the things that have come into my life, I just can't believe how much good fortune I've had in sometimes having to be in the right place at the right time, and if I'm not, why I try and do something so that I am in the right place. And I hope I'm in a good place here, and I hope you are too. I was talking about our wonderful World Affairs Council in Los Angeles. It's one of my favorite activities to attend out there. There's another chap here, is a classmate of mine from West Point, and he says that a few of you people who've been around the World Affairs Council might remember him. Bruno Gio is what his name is. He has a little trouble standing there. So he and I go kind of way back from the entrance exams or congressional exams or whatever the hell it was that we met each other first on Governor's Island, was it? Yeah? No, wait a minute. I didn't.
I got to tell a story.
Now, wait a minute. Briefly.
This is going to be quick. I was lucky enough that my father sent me to a prep school for a year before I went to West Point. And for a year, I did nothing but prepare for the entrance examination, physical and mental. So we go to Governor's Island to take the test, the math test. Kids from New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, about 150, 200 kids in a room. We go through, I go through the test. I'd seen it 100 times. I look up, all the heads are down. Pretty good. So I turn to the center aisle, walk to the proctor to hand my exam in, and him is this blonde-headed SOB walking the other way. Next day, we do the physical stuff. Push-ups like this on the P-bars. Everybody does 10. I do 14. This blonde-headed kid does 16. Then we do this. Everybody does 9. I do 12. He does 15. I couldn't stand it anymore. I said, my name is Bruno Giordano. They call me Gio. He's I'm at Aldrin. They call me Buzz. And that's where I met that blonde-headed son of a gun.
Now, now in plebe year, we had something in physical education called wrestling. And I thought I was pretty good at doing wrestling, but not against this guy. He's a little heavy. The space program sort of started with 3 people in the world. A Russian, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and the German, Hermann Oberth, and the American, Robert Goddard. Now, I got to meet Hermann Oberth on his 90th birthday in Germany. And Tsiolkovsky the Russian had already died by that time, but Oberth was he had an apprentice, Werner von Braun. And of course, we know the contributions that he was able to make. But the American, Robert Goddard. My father grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he graduated from the high school at age 15 and went to Clark University. It's right there in Worcester. And his physics professor was Robert Goddard. Then he went to Worcester Polytech, got his master's degree, and started at MIT, and didn't quite finish his doctoral work. He got called up for really kind of the end of World War I. He didn't like the coastal artillery. He got in the Signal Corps because they're the ones that were playing around with airplanes and balloons. He finally finished that up, and his assignment was, now there may not be too many people here that know this guy. I forgot his name too. Come on, you got it. Well, anyway, he was an aide in the Philippines to Billy Mitchell. You know who he is. Okay, he was later tried for disobeying orders, and that was the court-martial of Billy Mitchell. I don't want to go into that, but my father was his aide in the Philippines, and there was an army chaplain who had 2 daughters and a son, and my father kind of took a liking to the older daughter, and she became my mother. Her name was Marion Moon. So that's my mother's name, yeah. And it was no big deal to go to some place and Mama Moon would take care of us all. In high school, you have a yearbook and you got pictures in it, and everybody's got their picture in their yearbook and graduation, and something is written underneath it. And what we did then was take it around to people we know, and they would say something on their picture and sign it. Well, we had a very smart guy. He was a valedictorian of the high school. And underneath, well, a lot of us knew that he was going to go to MIT. I turned down a scholarship there. Now, underneath his picture, it said, rockets to the moon. So I came around and I said, would you sign my yearbook? And he signs it, and it says, I'll build them, you fly them. Now, this is in high school. He was a professor at MIT and an advisor to the Air Force, I think, in science. We're talking about the advancement of humanity beyond the horse and buggy, beyond the automobile and the choo-choo train. And then somebody starts flying a balloon, and the Wright brothers come along, and they find a place where the winds are just right in North Carolina, and they do a few inventions, and the Wright flyer takes off, first powered air flight. And that was in December 17th. Well, anyway, it was 1903. That was the same year my mother was born. So I kind of traced my heritage back to there. And among a lot of other things that I got to do in combat in Korea, and a lot of other interesting things on nuclear alert, 5-minute alert with nuclear weapons. I was going to ask the previous speaker, but just what kind of fusion? DT fusion? Been spending 30 years and $30 billion, and we're not any further ahead than we were when we started. Helium-3, nobody asked him about that. There's a lot of that on the moon. But there's another fusion process, boron-11 and protons. And that's pretty good. That's a company that I've been with. It was started by a professor who discovered plutonium. He was at one of the national labs in California. My background has covered a lot of different areas, but I was a fighter pilot, and I decided that it was time for me to augment my education at MIT, because that's where my father had gotten his doctor's degree. As a matter of fact, my father, after the Philippines, he started an engineering school for the Air Corps, U.S. Air Corps. And McCook Field became Wright Field, and it's now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And the engineering school for the Air Corps is now called the Air Force Institute of Technology. So that was the engineering school. My father was the head of that, a commandant for 5 years. Now, he moved on to be associated with an oil company, Standard Oil, New Jersey, 30 Rockefeller Plaza. So that's why I said yes when they said, would you like to play a part in 30 Rock? I said, yeah, I'll curse at the moon with Tina Fey. Going back to MIT from being on alert with nuclear weapons in Germany, using fighter pilot techniques, in 61, 2, and 3, we knew that we were going to put things into space, and we knew that we'd have something there and we'd want to go and join up with it, called Rendezvous. And I looked at that and looked at what other people had been doing in that field, and it just didn't make sense, whatever they were doing. Even the company that was going to build the spacecraft, McDonnell Douglas, had an approach, and they were building the Gemini spacecraft with 2 guys in it to follow Mercury with 1 person and complicated Apollo with 3 people. So we were going to do things in the Gemini program to demonstrate rendezvous, long-duration space flight, computer reentry, spacewalking, and rendezvous. So I used that sort of as a model at MIT, and came up with something that was similar to flying airplanes and similar to fighter pilot techniques, where you, let's say you're on downwind leg and you want to turn base leg, and then you're approaching the end of the runway and you start your turn to final. Now, everything has been sort of by rote. You see something, you do something that you know is right. But now you're going to intercept and you're going to start guiding the turn, the altitude, the airspeed. You're controlling everything, and that's guidance. And I took those kind of techniques to try and get the optimum and figure out how to get an object in space and how do you get the optimum trajectory. And then we set up the conditions so those would arise. And in 1962 and 3, I even went down to NASA to talk to Gus Grissom and some of the other people who were head of that program. I finally got my doctor's degree, and while I was at MIT, a good friend of mine who died in the Apollo fire, Ed White, he was behind me one year at West Point and was in the Air Force in Germany at the same place. He went to Michigan, got a master's degree, the test pilot school, got through there, and next thing I know, he calls me up and he says, you know, NASA's looking for people in this third group of astronauts. He says, I've gone through all this stuff. I'm a test pilot. I've been testing there. I'm going to apply. And I said, Ed, you remember when we were flying together? I could shoot gunnery as well or better than you could, so I'll apply too. So I did, and he was picked in 62, and I wasn't. But the stuff I was doing at MIT sounded like something that maybe NASA might be interested in, so I was selected at that point to be an astronaut in 1963. And I finally got to fly in the Gemini program on the last mission. It looked for a while like I might not even get a chance to fly, even though I had developed some rendezvous techniques that they were using. But I did, and one of the big challenges was spacewalking. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see that there's somebody riding on the top of a big fish. Now, that big fish in the Galapagos Islands is known as a whale shark. And my son took the picture, but that, of course, is me on the top. Now, we were going to have another gentleman following us from George Washington University, and he was going to talk about don't spend any money in space. Let's investigate the oceans. Well, I'm all for the oceans. And we can do an awful lot of robotic things with submersibles. But I'm also interested in going outward. You can only go so deep in the ocean. And I'm familiar with the people who went the deepest back in the 50s and 60s in the Explorers Club. And not too long ago, Jim Cameron went down to the bottom of the ocean. Now, he doesn't say this too much, but in my home, he said, before this happened, he said, I got an interesting project. I think I'm going to investigate going down to the deepest part of the ocean. Would you like to come with me? And I said, well, sure, I would. See, he knew I was a scuba diver and all of this. But I think he found out that it just was going to cost too much to put 2 people in that submarine. And so I missed out. Well, other people had missed out the first time that Jacques Picard and the Navy Lieutenant Williams went down to the deepest part, 7 miles down. I am very concerned of the deterioration in the ocean, just as everybody is concerned about the atmosphere. We got problems up there called space debris, and of course we need to worry about those problems, and we have to worry about other things. And there was a competition that spurred on the space program, and it was because, going back to the end of World War II, the Germans developed the V2 missile, and it deposited bombs on southeast England. It's amazing, over 1,000 bombs came from V2s that were built in Peenemünde, Germany, by Werner von Braun and his folks. And I asked myself, sure, we did a lot of great things in World War II, because I was a teenager and followed that pretty closely, but we got the A-bomb, we got wonderful airplanes that came out of there, but why didn't we develop the V2? Well, there's something in our decision-making that didn't lead us in that direction, but it did lead Germany in that direction. And it almost had a major impact on the way that World War II ended up. It could have gone the other way. Had Germany gotten the atomic bomb, and with this kind of a rocket delivery system, England would have been made kind of a dust pile. Now, after the war, we were looking to get the German scientists, and so were the Russians. And after a while, we were surprised again by Sputnik. Now, why did the Russians do that, and why didn't we do that? Well, it's an interesting question. Those are some of the early decisions. But we did decide that if you could put something into orbit, you were going to put people there, and pretty soon they did. Yuri Gagarin was the first person into space. And Alan Shepard flew up and down, suborbital. Not a very big rocket, not a very big achievement either. It was up to John Glenn a good bit later. But before that, we had Yuri Gagarin, Alan Shepard, and the president said, how can we beat the Russians? Because we needed to catch up with them in technology. And so that's why stories went back and forth as to, but I just found out recently at MIT, 100th anniversary, now I didn't know this, and I don't think very many people did, but when Kennedy, President Kennedy, was trying to recover from the Bay of Pigs and wondering what he could do in space, he really went to the space people and said, can we get to Mars? And they said, Mr. President, no, not really. It's a little too far away. But we can probably get to the moon, maybe, before the Russians did. And it was going to take 15 years or so to do that. Well, he wouldn't settle for that. He said, within this decade, we're going to send a man, not a woman, a man to the moon, and we're going to bring him back safely. I like that part. That sounded pretty good. But I just happened to be working on my doctor's thesis at MIT when all this came about. And lo and behold, the space program moves along, and I get to fly in the last mission. And what was the problem that we were facing? Well, we knew how to do rendezvous. I'd helped to train some of the people. Sure, we had to do rendezvous, but the big problem was spacewalking. People were getting too tired and overtired. Well, I'm the scuba diver. I'd been diving for almost 10 years before that. And when somebody thought, gee, it might be a good idea if we trained underwater in spacesuits with weights on and your neutral buoyancy. And I said, yeah, that's good. So I was the first person to do that training underwater. And it made a big impact on the last mission in the Gemini program. And because of that, I was then in a fairly favorable position among about 30 other people, 35, 40 other people. And it just happened Neil Armstrong and I were on the backup crew with missions changing because the Russians might fly around the moon before we could. It became Apollo 8, being the first mission to fly to the moon and to orbit it for 10 orbits. That was the second time somebody had flown in the Apollo capsule, and the first time we ever put them on the big Saturn V, and we sent them to the moon. That was really a bold decision to make, and it probably got us ahead. I have another story I can talk about which was going to be the first landing, and as it turned out, Neil and I were backing up 8. So by the time it flew, you'd have a crew for 9 and 10, so we would fly on 11. Well, it turned out that in 1967, there was one of the modules that came off the production line, and it wasn't until the 6th one that it was lightweight enough to be qualified to make a landing. Well, LEM 5 wasn't going to make a landing, and that's the one that we were going to be assigned to. We didn't know that because who's now a good friend of mine wanted his spacecraft, LEM 5, to land. And he thought he could reduce the weight by several different ways. So we went to the head of the Apollo office and said, George, Lowe, if I reduce the weight, can you fly this? Sure, we'd like to get there one mission sooner. So he got the weight down, and LEM 5 that was assigned to Apollo 11 landed first instead of Apollo 12 in October of 1969. So I don't think there's anybody in the room that knew that little detail. Back in the preparation missions, building the spacecraft, we knew what was expensive, and it began to add up, and it took about 3.5% to 4% of the discretionary budget. And by the time we went to the moon, it was beginning to come on down, and Vietnam had a conflict over there. There was questioning of the establishment and civil rights movements. And we continued to fly, but we canceled out the last 3 missions. But we landed successfully in 6 out of 7 missions. And then we ended the Apollo program. I had gone by that time to command the test pilot school. That isn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy because I'd been there a couple of years before. But right, another classmate, and this one, his last name was Vandenberg. And I don't know how many of you know that there was a chief of staff of the Air Force named Hoyt Vandenberg. Well, that's his son. So he got to go to the Air Force Academy, not me. I have been curious about better ways to do things. And in addition to rendezvous, when I got some things put together, just as a sidelight, I knew we knew how to get to the moon. I thought we knew how to get to Mars, but how the hell would anybody ever get to a star? So I decided to write a science fiction story that came out in 1995 called Encounter with Tiber. And it's better than Star Trek and better than Star Wars. Paramount and ABC didn't progress too well, and Disney came to ABC. They said, "You got a story about Mars?" And they said, "Well, a little bit. It's about going to the stars and other things." So they said, "Get rid of it. We got a wonderful movie coming out called Mission to Mars." Well, it wasn't very good. But I got the rights back, and it's been a long time trying to get that back into science fiction. I'm getting the high sign to kind of, well, before that, in 1995, 10 years before that, I had thought, well, maybe there's some way to use the gravity of one object, because we'd done that by sending a spacecraft out to Jupiter, and it would bend the trajectory, and it'd go to Saturn and then Neptune. And all of these were changed direction by coming by, and the gravity would bend it. So I said, well, sure, we went to the moon and left the Earth, and we went to the moon and went around it and came back. We were on a free return trajectory. So it was using the gravity of the moon to come back if we didn't put ourselves into. Sure, we had experimented with that, but nobody had really thought about doing that in the future, but I did. So I came up with a cycling trajectory between Earth and Mars, and it would come back. It had a few good points, obviously, and it had some that weren't so good, but Purdue University picked up the idea from JPL, and they've done it every other orbit. And that is now the plan that I have been putting forward from 2000, especially to the President's Council Commission in 2009, and it was called Unified Space Vision instead of Vision for Space Exploration, because a vision in the future is more than just exploration. It's science, development, commercial, and security, very important. Now Purdue is undergoing a senior study for 3 months. The entire program that I've sort of been putting together for how we, over a period of now to 2040, how we can do different exploration missions to objectives in an evolutionary way that will enable us in the 2030s to start using these cycling orbits that swing by. And now the cycler has all the necessary support system on board, so we need to intercept it with just a lander. And we're going to use what's on board and then get off when we get to Mars and land. Well, if you can do it with one lander, 2, how about 3? And if the landers as we used to think, would have 6 people in them. That's 18 people to the surface of Mars. And I have triple redundancy in the maneuver to catch up. And that's because I've had experience and seeing things being developed and all the things we went through in the 60s and 70s, and I've been putting those together to work. And so we're now discussing, is it worth going into space? Well, what's the big result of Apollo? Space Defense Initiative, SDI, a defense against missiles, branded facetiously by the media as Star Wars. Oh, we're going to have wars in space. And that's what President Reagan sort of presented to Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev knew that the Soviet Union did not have the industrial capacity that we had in order to build a missile defense system, because they knew, and they saw us get to the moon and they didn't. So you want to know what space did for us? It ended the Cold War. And we will use that high technology to expand it outward. Now, we haven't done real good a job in doing that kind of recently, and that's why I've formed this one group to look at the past and also to look at the problems right now. Our relations with China are very important because it can, working with China at the moon, they'll get there first, but we're not going to land anyway. We're going to help them and all the other nations by participating in telerobotics away from the moon at libration points. We'll design a base on the near side and the far side, and we'll support science, robots, and we'll support commercial activities that'll make use of the ice crystals, turning that into water. And I'm being told I got to sit down anyway. But we have very good plans to be active at the moon, doing things that we need to know how to do at Mars. And we're going to concentrate our resources on going to Mars. And if we don't do that, China will kind of take over the moon unless we sort of work with them. If we go to the moon and commit our resources, China's going to kind of win the moon anyway. So we've gotten behind them, and it's cost us a lot of money. And who's going to get to Mars? Probably Russia or China. And when they get there, they're not going to turn around and come back. They're going to stay. And I would love to answer the question of when the first people land on Mars, do we bring them back in a year and a half after they've been there and then do some more, and or do we leave them there? We leave them there. So, okay, I'm going to allow my friend to talk about astronomy. Yeah.
So, please.
And
thank you.
Because I was going to go through this maddening chart over here and tell you how we get to the space station and go to the moon and refuel and then send cycling orbits to and from Mars. But I don't always plan things to come out just the way I would like them to. So I may keep you here a little late.
Good afternoon, everybody. As I get my text up here really quickly, a couple of things. I think I'll start out first by saying that I'm afraid my experience isn't quite what Colonel Aldrin's experience is. I hope he'll excuse me, but nothing quite like that. I have the great pleasure of working at a really wonderful institution in Philadelphia, Franklin Institute Science Museum. I've been there for some time, and as many of you probably have been here, I have been a great advocate of space exploration ever since I can remember, from my earliest remembrances of what I might be interested in as a subject. I've always thought of space science and astronomy. As it turns out, I've come out with a career in astronomy, which I absolutely love. But at the same time, I have always followed space exploration very, very closely. I was that nerdy kid in the schoolyard who knew all the details about the engineering of the Saturn V launch vehicle and all the engineering information about the Apollo capsules, all that sort of stuff. I think I wore white socks back then. I don't have white socks now, but I do have the directions inscribed on my socks from Greenwich Observatory in England, so that way I don't get lost. I try to keep up with my nerdishness. In any case, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we really want to get to the part about whether or not we should do this, but there's some things I do need to sort of establish for you as some baseline for thinking about this issue. And it's a really important issue for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are really obvious, and some of them are not so obvious. And you know a lot of them, so I'll run through them really quickly just as a way to frame how you understand how I think about this and how I talk about these things when I'm asked to speak about them. Number one, the genie is out of the bottle. The genie is out of the bottle. There will never be a time going forward when there will not be people in space. One of the most amazing facts I can think of is that people have been living and working in space for 20 years. Living and working in space 20 years. Do you know that International Space Station flies over Philadelphia between 4 and 7 times every day? Every day. Every day. 6 people flying over Philadelphia every day. So that's a remarkable fact. We're already there. We're never not going to be there again. I think that national agencies around the world should pool their resources and work together. We have varying amounts of experience, but we all have a desire to want to do this for varying reasons. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy to make the road, smooth out the path for this kind of partnership, but we all do have resources. I don't think one country has all the resources necessary to do everything, nor should we really do it separately, because we should think of space the same way we think of Antarctica. It's a place that ought to be treated with respect. It's a place that should be provided, access should be provided by everybody who wants to go there. And we should all have that kind of scientific respect for what goes on there. We should share the information that comes from space. We need to understand that private companies can demonstrate and maintain, private companies that can demonstrate and maintain the same standards of safety and reliability as NASA should be encouraged to participate in space exploration. We all know what has happened recently with the great opening of the doors for commercial operations, private industry as they're called, to help providing access to low Earth orbit. I think SpaceX has done a fabulous job at that, and we'll see more stuff coming from that. As I said before, the space environment everywhere should be treated in the same way as our national parks or as Antarctica is treated. And I think funding for NASA should be doubled. Should be doubled, right?
At least.
Let me put that into the colloquial perspective that everybody understands. 1 penny of every tax dollar goes to NASA. What's 2 pennies? I'd gladly give 2 pennies for that. If you look at the budget of the United States, the line items in the budget of the United States budget, NASA ranks as 14th or 15th, coming in this year at $18 billion. $18 billion, that's a lot of money, right? If you look at Health and Human Services or the Defense Department, their annual budget every year is nearly $550 billion each. Every year. NASA does a tremendous amount with $18 billion. Imagine what could happen if there were $36 billion available to spend on space exploration, on the work that NASA does overall. Not just the space work, but the aviation work and also the Earth observation work that happens. It would be a tremendous advance if that kind of funding were available. But at the same time, the other thing that has to happen is that funding should be dedicated to a long-term, robust, and living mission plan rather than be tied to the current whim of any political party. It has to be done that way, of course. Now, I think space exploration is extraordinarily important for two other really big reasons. One of them is that space exploration pulls interest in technology upward. It provides a target, a lofty goal for kids who might want to dream about the biggest things possible to shoot for. And so that's a really good reason why we should explore space, because it pulls all of our technological capability up. That becomes extremely important for this last reason that Colonel Aldrin mentioned a little bit about, and that is space exploration demonstrates our superiority in science, technology, and by extension, in military capability and preparedness. Hear me out. We need to show that we are superior to all others in these areas. Think about the geopolitical environment in which we find ourselves today. If we don't demonstrate this superiority, the moment an adversary thinks we're weak, the slightest bit weak, they will challenge us, and they will attempt to take us. We're leaders. Every leader has a target on their back. It's always the way it is. So, for these reasons, and quite a few more I'm sure you can think of, I think space exploration is really, really, really important. Well, there are a lot of other things that we consider as well. I'm not going to go into those. We can do that during the discussion. But I'll leave that there just as a framework for you to think about, along with all the other things that come to mind for you about whether or not space exploration is important for us as humans. My work at Franklin Institute shows me that kids everywhere love space. Every kid, 6 to 8 years old, what's their favorite thing to do? Recite all the planetary names and ask me why Pluto is no longer considered a planet. That's one thing we have to do something about. I'm tired of those questions. But the other thing about space exploration for kids is they see that as a lofty dream of something outlandish and outrageous that can be done. Or they think it can be done. It has happened. And in learning more about that, it improves their knowledge base in science and technology. And that kind of knowledge is critical to our world today, even if it doesn't end up in space exploration for everybody, which it can. That kind of knowledge base is extraordinarily important to continuing the development of quality of life for everyone on the planet. So with that, I'll be done. We'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to start with why is Pluto no longer a planet, but we'll save that.
I'm sorry, I have to.
So you both obviously are staunch advocates, and it seems like most of this audience is staunch advocate of manned space exploration and as you say, beyond exploration, colonization, if you will. But the reality at the moment is we're paying the Russians to put our astronauts into space. And the Chinese are likely to be the next humans to step foot on a body other than the Earth, namely the moon. So my question is, what happened to the American national commitment to space? Why did we go from Apollo to where we are now? What do you think the factors are? And not just sort of narrowly political factors, but cultural and psychological factors, if you will, that have changed the landscape so dramatically in a relatively short time?
I think it's very important to understand how we got to where we are today. And you can't just say, well, the public wasn't interested, or we didn't get enough money, or other priorities. Why are we fooling around out there and spending our money doing that? Well, the money doesn't get spent out there. It gets spent here on advancing technology and building complicated spacecraft to keep human beings alive and comfortable under adverse conditions. And in order to do that, we have to understand a lot more about what goes on in the human body. And in floating around, you're not stressing your bones. So calcium comes out of your bones, and we have to do something about that. We have to understand why that happens. I think we do. But we also have to understand that some people get nauseous when they first get into space, and I have my own ideas that are better than NASA's as to why that happens. But I think that looking at what other nations are able to do and what we can do, and who's our friend and who's not our friend among other nations, we have to put all of that together and decide how are we going to get the most out of advancing things so that other nations will see that we're moving in a direction of accumulating more and more technical expertise and understanding the science of space, the other planets, potential for life in other places. And I think that we're going to want to find a way to bring nations together that right now, I don't think very many people in the room realize that there's a law in Congress that forbids NASA people to even talk to the Chinese. Okay? Now, somehow they get around that when the administrator goes over there, and us retired guys, you know, I can talk all I want to the Chinese, and I intend to, because we want to work with them, not against them, and if we push them away from us, they're not going to change their human rights abuses. It's an authoritarian government. Can you look in history and see where a strong authoritarian dictatorship, whatever, didn't have people that didn't like what was going on with the government? They were called revolutionaries. And if you didn't keep them down, one way or another, they're going to get you out of office. And that's why you might get a little mean occasionally to some of these revolutionaries. Now, have you ever heard that a nation trying to put down the revolutionaries would stop doing it because another nation says, naughty, naughty, you shouldn't do that? History doesn't tell us that either.
I'll let
Yeah.
Derrick jump in. Sure.
You know, this is always a very complicated question because it involves so many different factors. There's the geopolitical situation, there's the economic situation here in the United States, and then there's the social situation in the United States, as well as the way people learn and the way that we disseminate or collect information here individually. All of these things play a role. And of course, the things that have stood out most prominently have been the geopolitical situation in the United States in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and the economic or financial situation in the United States at that time. But when we look at the other factors that really do play a role in whether or not we do explore space or not, there's a bit of a question about what has happened to the major voice that decides what happens with these kinds of things. And that voice is the general public of the United States. One of the things I always say about space exploration is if you want it to happen, it can happen. But you have to make it happen. And the way that you have to make it happen is you have to press on your congressperson to tell them that this is important to you. I always think that if any one affinity group in the United States ever voted together, that affinity group could change history. And so one of the things that's dependent upon is the fact that we won't do that. So if you don't press on your congressperson won't understand that this is important to you. If enough of us do that, then Congress has to, by dint of your desire for this, push these issues through as being important to the American people. So one of the things that has happened, that did happen, is that as our attention turned from the great success of the Apollo program, with nothing really of great strength to follow it, the next thing that happens is the next big thing that dominates the headlines of our media and brings us the messages that really command our attention. None of those things have anything to do with space exploration. In a way, I believe the media decided for us that space exploration was over and that we didn't need to really be so excited about that anymore. It's already been done, but that's completely untrue. So much was accomplished during the Apollo missions, from the engineering to the exploration. Goodness gracious, humans on another body in the solar system. That's a story that rides the headlines, I think, for a good 20 years. But that's not what happened. So once our attention is turned from that, if we ourselves don't make an effort to get back to that as being really, really important, then it doesn't happen. Now, the one thing I saw NASA do in the late 70s and 80s that I thought was a really great idea to get people interested is they published a set of posters. And they were posters of Space Shuttle right at launch, about 3 or 4 seconds after liftoff. And these big, beautiful color posters had a crawl, not a crawl, but some text that went down the side. And it said, NASA, going to work in space. And I thought that was one of the most powerful images that said what NASA was doing in terms of advancing than anything else that was out at the time. But those posters didn't last very long. And I felt that if they had stayed around much longer, if they could have stayed around longer, they'd be a great inspiration to people and to kids to want to pursue this as a career possibility. So I think all of those kinds of things in the social arena of how we get our information, what our interest is, what our education is in science and technology, all feed into what happened.
We have, we have 15 minutes left,
Yeah.
and I just want to have some questions from our audience, get
Sure.
our audience into this.
I was just going to say that back in those years, nobody ever heard of the word STEM. There was no such thing as science, technology, engineering, and math. We were up at the top. We're not there anymore, and that's why we're motivating our education system to encourage and develop the inspiration, the desire to want to exceed in your education, maybe in the geek areas. So if you add A for arts in there, it becomes out STEAM.
And that's important too.
Okay, we have the best T-shirt in the room needs to ask the question. Please.
Thank you for your time, gentlemen. I really do appreciate it. My question was simple. When will humans set foot on Mars?
Not soon enough. Sorry.
We could probably get somebody there if we were solely interested in getting there. And as President Kennedy said, it'd be a good idea to bring him back. But if you really look into the challenge of getting people there and what it takes to do that and why you want to do that, I think you come to the conclusion that so much can be done in orbit around Mars, by looking down, that until you are ready to commit to permanence on the surface, stay in orbit, okay? Now, I say that, but I think we're ready to do the surface right now, because I think we can prepare to be ready to commit to that as a nation, because it's not just going somewhere and coming back. This is the human race advancing to a point where not just a neighbor where you can go and kick up dust and come back. That's what we did, looked at a lot of things, but we can go somewhere and begin to become a two-planet system.
Please.
Hi, I'm John. I'm a contributor at Forbes. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for having this discussion. I think it's an important one and not one that we have enough. So I appreciate this discussion. I just want to ask, why are we talking about putting all of our eggs in one basket? To me, talking about space exploration, the government, is a discussion that we can have, but I don't know, I would love to get your thoughts on space exploration in the private sector. Like, to me, I think something that's super interesting, and I hear a lot of young people talking about, is SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the future of that world. So I think space is on the up and up. We heard from the Millennials panel today, Stacey Ferreira talked about, space being one of the things that she's most excited about, and I think it's in the zeitgeist of our times today. So I think the future is really bright for space, but I would love to hear about it from the perspective of the private sector, not public.
Just to use the smallest amount of time possible to answer your question, I agree 100%. I think it's incredibly important because I think NASA's the focus that NASA can do best are the big missions, tackle the big things. And I think that the companies that are coming up, the private industries, are doing a fantastic job of doing a lot of the sort of like light work for NASA right now, if you will, of delivering, supplies up to International Space Station and such like that. But I know their role is going to grow. But I think it's really, really important to bring in, as I said, as many of those companies that can do it safely and economically as possible so that we can make use of all of the talent that's out there to advance us out into space.
Most everything that gets done is for a return on investment, and usually it's short. You don't just put money out there and expect something in 20, 30 years. So the attention span of political people is, can what I do help me get reelected? That's what the attention span is on so many people in Congress. Now, the best way to get elected is to deal with the people back home and give them something. So you bargain with other people in the House or in the Senate, and I'll give you this if you give me that, and pretty soon pork is delivered and a bridge to nowhere, and we sort of have a rocket that is the result of things we put together in the 70s and 80s, and that's the way we want. And the world is moving fast past us with Elon Musk and SpaceX and the Chinese, and we just have to make some changes in how we look at things. And I think that it's not the same as the government sponsoring the early aviation industry by having the hotshots carry the mail from one place to another, and they demonstrating that they can carry the airmail, and then somebody says, well, why don't we start taking people? And the government helps them, but it's the commercial people that could make a fairly quick profit out of doing that. The profits don't come quite so fast out of doing things in space. How long is it that Richard Branson has been saying he's going to have people up and down? Well, that doesn't happen right away. And we were going to use nuclear propulsion to get to Mars, but that isn't the way we're thinking now. So times do really change, and yeah.
Last question here.
Yes, thank you. Are any of you gentlemen familiar with, or can any of you gentlemen update us as to what, if any, progress SpaceX has made towards building a human-rated launch vehicle to the space station? And related to that, can anyone update us as to whether Bigelow Aerospace has made any progress towards building their own space stations. Thank you.
I think that SpaceX, Elon Musk is a very brilliant guy in learning how to face a problem and then coming up with solutions to it, and hiring people and judging what their talents are and what they say, and then coming forth with a fresh and new approach to things. And landing a rocket like coming back down again. People have thought about that for a while, and I have. I still prefer wings and wheels and come back and land this way rather than using additional fuel to come down. But, we'll see what proves to be best.
I think the last I heard, which is not too long ago, SpaceX expects to have their Dragon capsule man-rated within the next 2 years. And Bigelow Aerospace, if you don't know about Bigelow Aerospace, it's a really great story. We'll go into that another time. But Bigelow's using these in inflatable volumes, if you will, to create livable habitats in space. And he's actually flown a couple of these to test in Earth orbit. And on the website, there used to be, I don't know if they're still there, but they had this really ingenious thing. They launched the inflatables, and they put tiny video cameras inside with little toys, and they knew that they had reached Earth orbit and everything was stable. When the inflatable actually inflated, the cameras came on, and they could see the toys floating around in zero G. But it's a really great idea, I think, and I think that Bigelow also has more testing coming up in the next year or two, and they're really moving along at quite a clip to provide inflatable kinds of habitats for Earth orbit.
My plan includes using those as habitats in space because they're probably the earliest we could get without letting contracts out to big companies and coming up with something rather expensive. The particular design that he has could be used now to go with Orion and to go for a 1-year mission out to an asteroid. And when it gets there, guess what? A year and a half earlier, we've sent a robot out there, and the crew gets there 2 days before the asteroid, and the crew can stay 60 days there. And part of the crew can be an asteroid scientist, a mining scientist, and the guy who built the robot, and they can stay there. I don't know whether you know about this asteroid redirect mission, but that's where you go out and you get a rock of some sort and you bring it back to the area of the moon, and then you send a crew to look at it there. A lot of people, including myself, are very skeptical as to what we really get out of that. Now, we should either do it or not, or do something that makes sense. And I think we can do something that makes sense as a building block by using inflatables. And you can then do the same thing with something that you're going to put on the moon. You check it out in Earth orbit, and you go to one side of the moon, then the other side, and now.
Sounds good to me.
Men are from Mars, and women are from Venus. So let's fly women around Venus and come back. And that's what I've got somebody working on, because we could be doing that while China and other nations are living in the places that we designed, and then we bring them together remotely, because we need to know how to do that to get to Mars.
I want to thank our guests. If we are concluded for this session, please.